Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the Capitol Forum to debut our recently added Louisiana data to our upstream oil and gas production database. It spans the Appalachian Basin and the Haynesville Shale Basin in Louisiana. So thank you very much. We're going to do just a quick moment here of administrative housekeeping, and we're going to dive right on in and get ourselves ready for the weekend. For any questions, I'll try my best to monitor the questions chat here within the GoToWebinar application. We also have an email address that you can email editorial at the Capitol Forum. That's Capitol Forum with an O, editorial at the Capitol Forum, and one of our team members will be monitoring that and forwarding it on. We also received a few questions before the beginning of today's event, which I'll make sure to either get through in the main section or at the end, but please feel free to remind me. So with that, let's get started. So here we are. I'm sharing my screen. Please let me know if there's any problems in seeing things. The font might be a little small. I'll zoom in here where I can, but it's less about seeing every single piece of text for the home page. So this database tracks both the production and the ownership of assets. We built it to do a better job of having an understanding of what these non-producing, non-plugged wells look like. Initially in the Appalachian Basin to get a better idea of diversified energies inventory, but then we've continued to grow. Where other data providers maybe focus just on drilling permits or focused on just those horizontal wells that are producing all that oil and gas and kind of make the industry its principal money. We try to focus on the operations totally at every little piece of paper that we can get, and we try to reflect it here in this database. So we have, dated historical records, we have dated pipeline records, and from any state source that we can find, we figure out a way to scrape it, aggregate it, and sort it so that it can be interpreted by a user. Otherwise, from every state, it differs how they report oil, how they report their company name, how they report where they drill, and the list goes on. So we tried to curate this to kind of smooth over some of those inconsistencies, so that we could get an understanding, a true understanding of ownership. So let's navigate here through the platform. I've lost my little cheat code. There it is. So you'll see these are where our primary tabs are at the top: the home, operator, wells, regions, transfers, articles, reports, and data tab. The admin tab is just because it's through my profile. The operators is where we've put a lot of our work. And so we have events that date back to 1900, and we have production and permitting information that dates back to the 50s. And all of that is reflected in here. You can watch in the events tab as Standard Oil is broken up and then kind of comes back together again. It's one of my favorite things to see. So let's focus on what we're here for in Louisiana. And all of these operators, this is with all of the different states that we have. We have this filtering component on the left so that you can isolate what a number of different factors, right? The number of wells you're looking at, if you're looking for a company and its alias, if you want to isolate just the state. Here are the 750 operators in Louisiana. This is some historical legacy production in here. Like, for instance, EQT is that's from historic divestiture that's not been recorded accurately by the state agency. But I digress. My biggest challenge today is to not rabbit hole on too many different items. So here we would navigate to the regions tab and then list states and isolate Louisiana, which I've just preloaded right here. And you have a map. Now all these little bubbles aren't we can't physically display every single wellbore that's in Louisiana. So this visualization just randomizes what you can see. But as you can see right now, the closer and closer you get, it'll actually reflect, what's there and what's not. You'll see yellow is active, blue is abandoned, white is oftentimes orphaned, sometimes permitted and drilled. You can click on each well of your interest and navigate to that well in particular, which will give you information about the ownership and its historical production, when it was drilled, how deep it is, yada, yada. The magic component of Upstream here, though, isn't just this. We've all seen this before, right? Let me show you what makes this work. So one of the operators that we've done the most work on in Louisiana so far in mapping their legacy operations is BP. And there, so here I've done what I showed in that earlier tab. I've filtered the operator tab by Louisiana. I'm going to navigate to BP here, and this is what each company that has any kind of wellbore record in the states where we have data will have a profile page like this. And if we've mapped the subsidiary to the parent with which we've endeavored to do in each instance, you'll be able to see those relationships. So here we're in the top level parent operator, BP, formerly British Petroleum, as you'll see here. And the organizational hierarchy tab here to the bottom left, this indicates all that work we've done in the back end. So of tying the different entities that are affiliated with this organization that would otherwise be missed if you just downloaded the data from Louisiana. And to take a step back to explain, and this is just while I explain this, I'll leave this up. And again, I know you can't see like every single piece of text, but you get the idea. And we have this for every single company that where we've mapped these relationships. You can go into this organizational chart tab where it kind of looks at the umbrella of what we're uncovering. And I'll zoom back and explain what all this is. And I'll do it through the lens of diversified. 4.5 years ago, we were trying to figure out how many wells this company really owned, what their production really looked like. They had gone on this spree of acquisitions. They had a couple of affiliate entities that had changed names. They had a couple of other entities that were a subsidiary of an acquired entity that never changed their names. And there were a number of different ways that these operators were left over in the state records and kind of and left on the vine to dry and die, and what is commonplace for these operators is after they finalize, an acquisition, they'll do the appropriate paperwork that they need to do to get those really high producing, high quality assets on their books, because that's what they bought those assets for. That's what they're most interested in. Let's get that oil and gas out the ground, make us money, and pass it on to investors, or keep it in house if it's private. And obviously many variations therein, but you get the idea. All the while, the older entity, whether it's what was bought or a subsidiary before the name was changed, just sits there. And the new company that bought it never takes credit for, oh, hey, I want that liability. I want that well that's not been plugged. I want that well that had never produced and might be leaking. And it's just easier to say, oh, BPX KCS Resources LLC. No, we never bought that. And so that's what happens a lot. And so what we try to do in Upstream and have done is go to companies and say, hey, look, we found these 60 non-plugged wells in West Virginia that are right on your coal mine, and all the permits are underneath your company or your former company's subsidiary and before you went bankrupt. And by all indications, these would still be yours, and thus not the public's responsibility to plug. And in some instances, they say, oh, you're right, or they say, we divested those, and then those wells get taken responsibility of whoever bought it. And in other instances, they say, no, you're wrong, and they hope the regulator doesn't do anything. So it's not always like a perfect solution at the end of the day, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. So now zooming back into Louisiana, and here we are in BP. And just to show you all the different all of the different ways that this can manifest itself is like when you see these name variations here in the about box, you probably can't see that text. But here in this about box, you see these name variations, and this demonstrates that there were other groups, that somewhere in the state data, some wells still were tied to the British Petroleum Co. And, some people might search that, sure, but if you didn't think of that, you would miss those. Whereas here it's automatically tied into the appropriate entity. And all of those ties, all of those maps are corroborated by supporting documents, which brings us to this sub events tab within each operator. And all of those events you can see, okay, so from when it went from BP Amoco to BP in 2001, or when it absorbed Standard Oil in 1987. And if you wonder to yourself, where did they get this information? Here you can literally click on these supporting documents and navigate to the original Securities and Exchange Commission document that was filed, talking about the former conformed name of Standard Oil Company /in. That's probably a parenthetical for Indiana. Amoco Corporation, these are Eagle Holdings. This is how we kind of extract all this information to be able to tie it back to its appropriate entity. Just really quickly before I move on into more specifically asset retirement obligation identification, I just want to show a fun little kind of anecdote about just the fascinating information that like lives in the back end of Upstream, just waiting for an enterprising individual to pick it up. And again, just as a friendly reminder, please feel free to ask any questions, or if anything doesn't make sense, I'm happy to revisit anything. So yes, these events are insane, and it's fascinating to watch as the bankruptcies tick up in our event history database, and as they go away, and you can watch the boom and bust of these like relatively quite volatile commodity cycles, and the stories never change, and whether it's a coal company divesting its oil and gas assets, or it's a steel company divesting its oil and gas assets, whether it's a utility that used to own an upstream production asset that then divested it to another producer, which then sold it to a pipeline company, which then bought it again and resold it back to the original seller. All these different things, they come and go in waves. And an example I wanted to highlight was here in Gulfport Energy Corp. This is a company that we've done a lot of work on, as you can see here in the events tab. That's why I had it open. They filed bankruptcy most recently in 2020. They have assets both in the Appalachian Basin and in the Scoop Stack. And they have a super long history. I've written about them for 2.5 years, and I had no idea until we uploaded this Louisiana data that they had a history where they specifically were targeting legacy assets that were underperforming and trying to reinvigorate them with some type of a nuclear technology that I don't necessarily understand fully. Weren't able to turn that into something that was economical. Filed bankruptcy, and now fast forward 25 years and they're still kind of struggling with horizontal drilling. But it's the little gems like that, I think they really stick out to me, because being able to tie together these really antiquated entities that own significant assets, and it speaks to the nature of some of these companies. So here, what I was just referring to about their history is in this document, which I pulled up here. And you can see, yeah, prior to bankruptcy, and this is not their 2000, this is their 1990s bankruptcy. The company was engaged in acquiring mature oil and gas properties in the Louisiana Gulf Coast area, increasing both production and total oil and gas recovery through the use of advanced technologies, including so sophisticated radioactive logging equipment. So it's just, I think it goes to show the breadth of the kind of storytelling devices that this has. And so whether it's mature reinvigoration of assets or carbon capture and sequestration, that's all information that can be isolated by various filters. Here, whether it's the type, brine and disposal, for instance, or the operational status, orphan. So this shows us, for instance, that there's 4,178 orphan wells in Louisiana. And if I wanted to, I could export these results, and people will often react, wait, there's operators? And yes, there are many, some of which are active, which is why this data, in my opinion, is so important. Okay, so let's talk more about AROs. So here I'm back in like the home page where we started. If you clicked on this reports tab, this is an interesting component of one of the offerings of Upstream, is where we can generate these bespoke reports that you can download. You can also download the data within the platform, which if we have time at the end, I'll give an example of. One of the most used reports internally at the Capital Forum that we generate is this one, this second. And again, I understand the text is not necessarily large enough for you to read. Inactive, abandoned, orphaned, and shut-in wells list. As you can see, we just regenerated it on 9/11. That IAOS sheet is what a full list of every non-producing unplugged well in the states that we have data for. Someone asked, a breakdown of those by age, right? And so this would be a great way to get that data point. So I would click this, and it would download to my computer. It's 9 megabytes, and I don't want to test us. So I've downloaded it already. Just gonna take my word that that's what it looks like. Let me switch my screen share here. And this is what the data output would look like once you've downloaded that IAOS sheet. for anyone who was trying to figure out what the age of those would be. So writ large, of course, none of this data is perfect. Every single state that we've gone to, when we've tried to confirm anomalies we found or try to understand different categories that don't seem to be as easy to sort, they're always like, not always, but more often than not, they're like, we actually don't know. Or like, we made a mistake, or the company hasn't reported it correctly. So there's going to be a lot of noise. And that's just something that you have to kind of accept when dealing with this. That being said, we've done everything in our power and poured significant resources into trying to quiet that noise as much as we possibly can. But that being said, we can't create data where there's not. So in order to, for instance, find the age of these wells, the most valuable data point in my mind would be the spud date or the last producing date. And spud date just, well, I could get the actual definition here from our little database. But it basically just means when it's drilled and ready to start producing. And as you probably can't see, but it is not always populated. There are a couple, and if it was just you and whoever asked the question on the phone, with me, just one-on-one, I would sort this and create an equation to figure out the number of years and then find that average. Stereotypically, they're quite old though. When we've reported on this in the past, they can be as old as 50 to 80 years. They usually average in 20 to 35 year time span, but I'm painting with a broad brush there, of course. So this is what you get. This is the output. For the purposes of this conversation, I wanted to isolate it just in Louisiana. So I took just Louisiana data, that's this sheet, and then I created a pivot table. So this is a pivot table, and this is relatively important for you to actually be able to read. So this should be hopefully big enough. I'm sorry if I have anybody squinting. And this pivot table, these count of well IDs, that's giving us a well count of how many non-producing unplugged wells these various companies have. So you'll see Texas Petroleum Investment Company in Louisiana. So you'll see TPIC at the top, Hillcorp number 2. Both of those are private entities. Both of them have a very bad, or I should say, a very long record of non-compliance and environmental violations. And Invest is also private, as is Aethon. But eventually you get to some public ones. There you see Exxon there that's taking the top place for publicly traded companies that own non-producing unplugged assets. Diversified there, Comstock there, that's public. And that BP Denbury, which is about to get bought by Exxon. We'll talk about that hopefully a little bit later. And the list goes on. Chesapeake, and I mean, these are all significant numbers, 118, where these are not a few wells here and there. So let's talk about that. What's going on here? Let's use Texas Petroleum Investment Company as our first kind of case study. Switching you back to the platform. So here we are in Texas Petroleum Investment Company's operator tab, where I would have just navigated to this main operator tab and typed in Texas Petroleum Investment Company. Now you see there's not an organizational hierarchy, so this one's relatively straightforward. There may have been some typos we corrected and some operator ID serial numbers that we corrected, but for the most part, this just will report itself straightforward. So that's nice, right? Something that we help with relatively often is with journalists calling after some kind of emergency or situation like this has occurred. So, here's this tragedy in Louisiana where people's health was jeopardized and negatively impacted by the lack of structural integrity of these assets. That same day, a different outlet did kind of a deep dive on this operational history and wanted to identify where this well was. And there was a little bit of information, but there was kind of a bit of a scramble, right, to find it. We weren't connected with this outlet at the time, but if we were, I would have been able to find that. Here we are in St. Mary's Parish, so which you would navigate through regions, this regions tab, and then isolating Louisiana, and then you can go into the various parishes and counties in our database. The map moved itself a little bit on me while we were going through the different tabs, but before that, I had it located specifically on the part of the bay where this incident occurred. And then, let's pretend right now that it's that well, but it's not. But like I said, my map moved on me, but let's just pretend it's that well. And then I would be able to navigate to this well. And these are the wells that were a part of this issue, this BINVUA wells. Here's this blue one, BINBUA. This is TPIC, Texas Petroleum, and it's blue, which means it's abandoned, which means this needs to be plugged. And so, in Louisiana, generally speaking, you need to plug a non-producing well after 5 years. Let's see, the last production year was 2009. So just in like a matter of moments, we found a non-compliant, non-plugged well owned by this company that has an outsized inventory of those types of assets that is directly implicated in an emergency. So that's just an example of a kind of a well and operator combo of an analysis where you don't even need to get into kind of these more nuanced ownership queries. Like there's some kind of very straightforward files here where it's like, look, you're an active bona fide company, you're registered to conduct business in Louisiana, you have a registered agent, you are making money off of wells elsewhere, what gives? And that's been a relatively effective method in bringing about action on some of these wells in some instances, and others not so much. So let's really quickly pivot back to the Excel sheet. We're at 11:22. I'm not seeing any tons of questions, so that's good. And this is kind of the last case study that I wanted to highlight before we could kind of open it up to a more general discussion. So as I said already, ExxonMobil sports the highest count of non-plugged wells in Louisiana at this moment. And as we reported about this pending merger, and on Monday, I believe, if not Tuesday, Denbury announced that the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act waiting period had passed, and so that now all they need is the stockholder approval, so it's quite likely this merger is about to go through. So get to add that 168 of unplugged non-producing wells to Exxon's already #1 spot. Now, the reason why I wanted to highlight Denbury rather than looking at Exxon, switching us back to Upstream, Denbury's business model, and this is what our articles look like. And as you can see in the Upstream platform, we have a little tab for articles where you can navigate there, and all of our energy pieces are sorted right there, and you can click and read and learn, and you can also navigate from our library right back to Upstream. So here I am in our most recent on the Exxon Denbury pipeline, just very quickly on Denbury. So let me check. I just got another question. Denbury's business model is purported to focus around carbon capture and sequestration. As we wrote, their principal business is oil recovery and production through enhanced oil recovery, much of which is through carbon that comes from natural deposits, not artificial. They've done a good job of making people think that all this CO2, I think, is used from industrial sites, and that is increasing, and they plan to continue to increase that. But right now, it's something like 60 to 70% of their oil production that comes from enhanced oil recovery is from CO2 from natural deposits, which have declining stock last time I looked into it. Why am I talking about all this? Because carbon capture and sequestration companies, one of a new kind of industry talking point is that these non-producing unplugged wells can be reutilized for storage, for injection, for a number of different kinds of possible ways in the energy transition. Now, we could talk all day about the scientific implications of that. Where are engineering standards? Is that been battle tested yet? And I'd be very interested in that discussion. But before we even talk about the technological feasibility about that, I think that Denbury's asset inventory makes it's that much more pertinent. They too are no stranger to distressed operations, having filed bankruptcy in 2020, and have not always been able to turn their main business model. Sorry, I'm getting more and more questions, so I'm doing a bad job of multitasking. But they've struggled to kind of demonstrate that their focus is going to be economical and advantageous. Obviously, with this Exxon merger, that's kind of a change for them as far as their struggle is concerned, and they've grown very in vogue from the perspective of an oil and gas industry player because they they allow themselves to kind of greenwash, not kind of straight, just objectively greenwash their oil production assets by getting more credit for using CO2 in the process. And because they're a smaller company and because they have less cash and they were already struggling to figure out how they would expand their CO2 network, it makes the fact that you see all these blue and red dotted wells in the middle of, you know, like nothing, I'm not seeing any yellow, or very little yellow, which would mean active. So it's like, what is this company doing? What are they sitting on? And so let's take a look at that. And so here I am in Denbury's wells subtab, and I'm isolating their abandoned, inactive, shut-in, and orphan wells. And I'm going to download that. And like last time, I've already pre-downloaded it just to save us some time. And just give me 5 seconds as I navigate to that Excel sheet. And similarly, and so this kind of gets to one of the questions about getting into the age, but in Louisiana, their shut-in status wells, there's a little bit of a nuance where they can be temporarily plugged. So I'm not even considering these. So these are all of the just no plug at whatsoever. And we're coming in at, so 2022, so 2018, so 14%, so 87. So we have 87 wells that by statute should have been plugged yesterday that Denbury is operating. And while a company might want to say, hey, we can retool this for carbon sequestration one day, if I was a regulator, I'd say, okay, retool the well that is going to be inactive in 5 years then, and fulfill your statutory obligation. So I think that I think there's ways to kind of detool some of this narrative about what to do with underproducing wells versus orphan wells, or, and the industry will conflate all these statuses often. And at the end of the day, if it's not produced in line with the statutory provisions and it's not been plugged, from a legal perspective, that's the end of the discussion. Whether or not regulators want to play hacky sack with the company to see if the company will actually bring these plans to fruition is up to them. But as you can see from sometimes these 3-4 decades long moments of these wells just sitting there idle, never doing anything, I think history for the most part would demonstrate that would be a risky move. Okay, so that's basically everything I have prepared for things to show off. If we had extra time, which I don't know why I thought we may, I was going to take us through a couple of wells that were plugged through the IIJA program, demonstrating how you can confirm that sometimes those wells that are getting plugged right now by the congressional funds are owned by active companies. But instead, I'm going to answer some of the questions that came in, and then just give like a 5-minute breather for any others. Okay. I'm first going to go with the number of non-producing wells that require plugging in Louisiana. I think the easiest way for me to do that would be through Excel. And the total number, sorry, I have to zoom it out, which I know makes it not good for the audience, but our grand total is 29,526 unplugged well bores that aren't producing right now, according to this, our most recent data. So that is including some shut-in wells that are temporarily plugged. But again, as far as the statute is concerned, the remediation is not complete. Of course, I can send this information to people who are interested. But yeah, the number is 29,526. And I'll show another way we can get it without even having to download anything. And then you'll have to excuse me for a moment as I catch up on some new questions that are coming in. So here I'm in the wells tab. I've filtered it by Louisiana. Then I'm going to operational status, and I'm filtering it by abandoned, inactive, orphan, and shut in. And if anyone's sitting there and wondering what the heck do any of these things mean, anywhere in Upstream, if you see this like small dashed underscore light blue line, you can click on it and it'll give you a definition, which will demonstrate to you how we're trying to sort these things. And so here again, you see 29,526 wells. Okay, so check. I also got a question about how to identify public company AROs, and I thought that was a great question. And it's not, this is kind of broad brush, but pretty much no matter what, they should have it somewhere in their security filings. Not always in their 10Q, so those quarterly filings, but in the 10K, the annual report filing, that's a great place to look for it. And not to sound too pedestrian, but stereotypically how I'll do that is I'll go in there into the 10K, Control F, I and Julia. And by the way, I need to give Julia credit for, and Matt Probus, great credit for helping me launch all this. So thank you, Matt and Julia. And I'm sorry I didn't do that at the beginning. But yes, to go into the 10K, Control F, and look for certain search terms. So like ARO, for instance, or retirement obligation or decommissioning are usually good hits. And then you'll see they'll disclose it in their balance sheet. And that number is not that good, you know, like beyond the fact that there are further AROs that are not being accounted for because they want to pretend like it's not theirs. But even the number that they are reporting and taking responsibility for will vary quite a lot from year to year, whether it's because of commodity costs, whether it's because of a sale, whether it's because of a change in production plans. There's a number of different ways that companies can say, sometimes, you know, very legitimately, other times there's a couple of other factors that are being, you know, kind of being shuffled around or being emphasized over others. But regardless, there's a number of different explanations that they can give to the Security Exchange Commission as to why that would change. So, you know, when I first started looking at this years ago, I think I thought that, you know, it would be very, very easy to track, but then because of how nebulous the number would be due to all the other ways and factors that influence how it's disclosed. And at the end of the day, the disclosure requirements around those AROs are pretty lax. But that's how, and it should be listed in the balance sheet. Okay, and 1 second. This is great. I got someone, does this include offshore wells? Yes, offshore shallow wells. It does not include deep shore federal wells. So here I am in listing states. I'm going to Louisiana, and you can see, and the GPS coordinates on the shallow water wells were crazy. So we did the best we can, but this is about as deep in the sea, so not so to speak, just that's as deep as in the sea as we get. And you'll see plenty of abandoned wells here too. Look at this one way out there. State lease. Hate to see it. Wow, drilled in 1954. 1993. Oh, look, this one's not taken over by the state yet. Talos. So yeah, this was Talos as well in 2019. I didn't Talos. So now you're watching me do live research. Probably no one wants to do this. Okay, all right, sorry, stay focused. But yeah, this is the fun. Look at this. Y'all need access. And so yes, this is what the offshore wells look like. And as you can see, they're having a hard time with the imagery because we're in the water. One day we'll have pipelines in here. Okay, moving on. Okay, I think that's it. Sweet. Y'all, thank you so much for joining. I'm sure this was a little overwhelming, and I apologize. I tried my hardest to think about a good, nice, concise way to demonstrate this. And we didn't even get into decline rates and transfers. And, you know, there's just, there are a lot of different ways that this data can be interpreted and analyzed that can go super far away in, you know, on the ground analysis or during, sorry, I'm getting another question, during a campaign or anything like that. So waiting for, does this include offshore wells? We got to that. All right. Thank you. I really appreciate you all joining. I'm happy to get you folks my contact information and answer any specific questions as it relates to an operator, as it relates to the federal grant program, as it relates to plugging, or as it relates to the production side. Really appreciated you all joining us, and hope you have a good day. Thank you. This will conclude our presentation.